The sky was an unyielding gray as I stepped out of Elliot Brooks' car, the brisk autumn air biting at my cheeks. The reservoir stretched out before us, calm yet curiously menacing, its surface like a sheet of tarnished silver. A faint breeze rippled through the water, making it appear as though something beneath stirred uneasily. Even standing at the edge, a deep-seated unease crept into my bones. There was something wrong about this place, something profoundly unsettling. Elliot adjusted his fedora and stepped onto the gravelly shore with the ease of a man who had seen enough of life's unpleasantness to be unfazed. His trench coat, though a little worn at the hem, gave him the air of a noir hero walking straight out of fiction. He turned back to me, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as they scanned my expression. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked, voice low and steady. I hesitated, my gaze fixed on the water that seemed to absorb the dull light without ever reflecting it. "I don't know what I'm feeling," I admitted, "but it's far from peace." Elliot didn't reply immediately. He had that habit, a deliberate pause that made people spill their words just to fill the space. I thankfully had learned better. "You'll have more to say after we see the body," he finally said, motioning toward the small cluster of figures further along the shore. The group consisted of 2 police officers and a coroner. Their voices kept low as though they feared disturbing the reservoir's eerie stillness. As we approached, the older officer, a tall, wiry man with a weathered face, tipped his hat in greeting. "Detective Brooks," he said, his tone betraying both respect and a hint of relief. "Glad you're here. This one's different." Elliot nodded in his customary way, a brief tilt of the head that conveyed acknowledgement without encouragement for further exposition. "Sergeant Doyle," Elliot addressed him. "This is my associate, Miguel Vasquez. He has a knack for unearthing the sort of historical and less conventional origins that might slip under the radar." Doyle's gaze flicked to me, polite but skeptical. I was used to it. People rarely knew what to make of a history teacher accompanying a private investigator. "Well, this case might be right up your alley then," Doyle said before leading us toward the covered body lying on the damp ground. The coroner, a stout woman with sharp eyes, stepped aside to allow us closer. Elliot crouched down, peeling back the sheet with a practiced hand. The drowned man beneath was pale and bloated, his eyes wide open and frozen in an expression of sheer terror. "Dear God," I muttered, instinctively crossing myself. Elliot glanced up at me briefly before returning his attention to the corpse. "That's not the half of it, Miguel. Look at his hands." I forced my gaze downward. The man's fingers were tightly curled around clumps of dark soil, almost as though he had clawed it from the earth itself. Mixed in with the dirt were fragments of something strange, small, intricately carved stones that glinted with an unnatural sheen despite the lack of sunlight. "What are those?" I asked, leaning closer. The coroner answered before Elliot could. "We're not sure. Never seen anything like it before. And here's the kicker. Those were in his hands when we pulled him out of the water." I frowned, trying to make sense of the details. "You're saying he was gripping these while he drowned?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," she confirmed, crossing her arms. Elliot stood, his eyes fixed on the stones. "Miguel, take a closer look. These carvings remind me of something you might have studied." I crouched down, carefully extracting one of the fragments. The surface was smooth yet cold, and the carvings, symbols I didn't immediately recognize, seemed ancient, almost pre-Columbian. This isn't just decoration," I said, turning the fragment over in my hand. These are ritualistic markings. The precision is too deliberate, too purposeful. Aztec, Elliot asked, his tone even but with a faint undercurrent of curiosity. Maybe, I murmured, but there's something off. It feels older, darker. Our exchange was interrupted by a sudden gust of wind that swept across the reservoir, carrying with it an almost imperceptible sound. A low, mournful wail that sent shivers down my spine. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the water. What the hell was that? Doyle muttered, his hand instinctively moving to the holster at his side. Elliot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the water's edge, his gaze piercing as though he were trying to see beyond the rippling surface. "Mr. Brooks, I wouldn't—" the younger officer began, his voice tinged with alarm. Elliot raised a hand to silence him. "The sound isn't coming from the surface," he said. "It's coming from below." His words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Even the coroner, who had undoubtedly seen her fair share of death, looked uneasy. "You're saying there's something down there?" Doyle asked, his tone skeptical but not dismissive. "I'm saying there's more to this place than meets the eye," Elliot replied. I joined him at the edge, my stomach churning with unease. "Do you think it's connected to the town beneath the reservoir?" Elliot turned to me, his expression inscrutable. "That's what we're here to find out." Before I could respond, the younger officer called out, "We've got another one." We turned to see him pointing toward a figure struggling in the water not far from the shore. The man flailed wildly, his screams piercing the silence as he sank beneath the surface. "Damn it!" Doyle shouted, rushing toward the water's edge. Elliot moved swiftly, shedding his coat as he prepared to dive in, but I grabbed his arm. "Elliot, wait! We don't know what's in there." He hesitated, his jaw tightening as he weighed the risk. The struggling man disappeared beneath the surface, and for a moment, all was silent. Then, without warning, the water erupted, and the man was flung onto the shore as though by an unseen force. We rushed to his side. He was gasping for air, his eyes wide with terror. "They won't let me go," he choked out, clutching at my arm with surprising strength. "Who?" Elliot demanded, kneeling beside him. "Who won't let you go?" "The miners," the man rasped, his voice barely audible. "They're still down there, and they're angry." The weight of his words settled heavily on all of us, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Elliot and I exchanged a glance, unspoken understanding passing between us. Whatever we had stumbled into, it was far more than a simple case of accidental drowning. The reservoir held secrets, dark, terrible secrets, and it was only a matter of time before they surfaced. The man's words hung in the air, fractured by the labored sound of his breathing. He trembled uncontrollably, soaking wet and cold despite the woolen blanket an officer had draped over his shoulders. The fading sunlight cast deep shadows across the shore, and the reservoir looked darker than before, almost malevolent under the encroaching dusk. My chest felt heavy, like the air itself resisted the idea of lingering here. Elliot knelt beside the man, his tone steady but pressing. "What do you mean, the miners? Can you be more specific? Are you talking about the ones from the old town that's submerged?" The man, skin pale and lips trembling, didn't seem to hear him at first. His eyes darted wildly as if searching for something or someone. I tried to place myself in his line of sight, crouching just slightly to meet his panicked gaze. "Sir," I said gently, though my nerves were fraying with every passing second. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you here. Just tell us what you saw." His lips moved, but no sound came out. After a few more moments, he managed to croak, They wouldn't let me go." "Who wouldn't?" Elliot prodded, his voice unwavering. "You mentioned miners." The man shivered visibly, his hands clutching the blanket as though it were the only thing anchoring him to the real world. "It's them. I swear it's them. I saw—" His voice cracked, and he let out a pitiful sob. "They're still down there in the water. They're—" He broke off, wheezing. I placed a hand on his shoulder, a futile attempt to lend some comfort. "Take your time," I said softly. "Start from the beginning if you can." His breaths came out in short bursts, like someone fighting an unseen weight crushing their chest. The officers shifted uneasily nearby, their stoic expressions betraying hints of discomfort. Meanwhile, Elliot maintained an inscrutable calm, though I could tell by the subtle tightening of his jaw that his mind was already dissecting every word. After what felt like an eternity, the man managed to speak again. "I shouldn't have gone out there," he whispered. "They told me not to, but I thought it was just stories. The kind old folks tell to scare you. But it's real. They're real." "Where exactly did you go?" Elliot asked, his voice deliberate. "And what did you see?" "I was fishing," the man stammered. "Just past the old dock on the eastern shore. The water, it's different there. Darker, like it doesn't belong." He paused, swallowing hard. "And then, the hands." The word sent an icy prickle down my spine. "Hands?" I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted the answer. "They came from the water," he said, his voice hoarse and uneven, grabbing at me, pulling me under. I tried to fight, but they were everywhere. I could hear them, whispering, angry, accusing. The image his words conjured sent a shiver through me, but Elliot appeared unshaken. "Did you notice anything else?" he asked. "Anything unusual before that happened?" The man hesitated, his brow furrowing as if straining to remember. "There was a sound," he said finally, "like crying. It was faint, but it was there, coming from the water." My throat felt tight as the pieces clicked together. The mournful wail we'd heard earlier suddenly felt far more sinister in retrospect. "Can you describe the hands?" Elliot pressed, his sharp gaze never leaving the man's face. "Were they human?" The man shook his head violently. "No, they weren't human. They felt wrong, cold and heavy like metal, but they had the strength of 10 men. I shouldn't have come here. I shouldn't." His voice dissolved into sobs, and he buried his face in the blanket. I stepped back, shaken. Something about his description struck a chord of primal fear deep within me. The rational part of my mind wanted to dismiss it as hysteria or hypothermia-induced delusion, but a deeper, more instinctual part of me wasn't so sure. "Officers, make sure he gets somewhere warm," Elliot said, rising to his feet. His commanding tone left no room for argument. The officers moved to escort the man away, but Sergeant Doyle lingered, his skeptical gaze fixed on Elliot. "Do you really think there's something down there?" he asked quietly. Elliot didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned his attention to the reservoir, his expression grim. "There's more to this place than meets the eye. And if even half of what he said is true, then we're dealing with something that won't go away on its own." Doyle exhaled sharply, clearly uncomfortable. "This is beyond my pay grade, Brooks, but I'll help where I can." "I'll hold you to that," Elliot replied, his tone neutral. As Doyle walked off, I followed Elliot toward the water's edge. The dying light painted the surface with an unnatural sheen, and the sound of the gentle ripples felt almost mocking in its serenity. "Do you think the miners really stayed?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Elliot didn't respond immediately. He had that habit of retreating into his thoughts when faced with a particularly perplexing case. His eyes remained fixed on the water, unblinking. "Something is keeping them here," he said at last, his tone measured. "Whether it's the curse of those artifacts or something else entirely, I don't know yet. But this isn't just folklore. There's intent behind what's happening." The weight of his words lingered heavily between us. I glanced back at the officers, now out of earshot, before lowering my voice. "You don't think this is something we can solve conventionally, do you?" Elliot's gaze shifted to me, his expression as sharp and piercing as ever. "You've studied the past, Miguel. You know better than most that the line between reality and myth isn't as clear as people like to believe." I nodded, though the thought offered little comfort. Over the years, I'd grown accustomed to seeing the supernatural woven into the fabric of history, but experiencing it firsthand was another matter entirely. Elliot's voice broke through my thoughts. "I need you to dig deeper into those symbols and artifacts. If they're as old and significant as you think, they might be the key to understanding what's happening here." I nodded again, my resolve solidifying despite the unease gnawing at me. "I'll head to the archives first thing in the morning. There's bound to be something about the town's history that can shed light on this." "Good," Elliot said, his tone softening slightly. "And keep an eye out for anything on water-related rituals or curses. Something tells me the answers we're looking for won't be simple." As we made our way back to the car, the sense of foreboding that had hung over the reservoir seemed to follow us like a shadow. The further we drove, the quieter I became, my mind racing with possibilities and half-formed theories. Elliot, ever the pragmatist, remained composed as he navigated the winding roads. But I could tell, even in his stoic demeanor, that this case was already starting to weigh on him. And deep down, I had a sinking feeling that it was only the beginning. The sound of crackling leaves underfoot was sharper than usual as I walked alongside Elliot that morning. The brisk mountain air felt like a wake-up call, biting enough to keep me alert but not unpleasantly so. The sun barely crept over the distant peaks, its pale rays doing little to dispel the lingering gloom clinging to the reservoir's edge. To the untrained eye, it was a picturesque scene, serene even, but I knew better now. Elliot carried his leather satchel slung over his shoulder, containing the tools of his trade. Notepads, magnifiers, an assortment of odd gadgets he rarely explained but often put to intriguing use. The satchel swung lightly with his steps, a symbol of his steadfast purpose. His sharp blue gaze was fixed on the path ahead, his focus unyielding. "How much sleep did you get?" I ventured, breaking the morning silence. My voice sounded louder than I intended against the backdrop of chirping birds and rustling branches. "Enough," Elliot replied curtly. He didn't look at me, his eyes scanning the terrain for any subtle disturbance. The word "enough" was a trademark Brooks reply, a vague, minimalist gesture toward humanity that let you know he wasn't completely robotic but wasn't interested in elaborating either. I, on the other hand, hadn't slept well at all. My dreams had been plagued with shadowy figures rising from dark waters, their skeletal hands reaching for me. I could still feel the phantom sensation of cold, wet fingers brushing against my skin when I jolted awake. We reached the edge of the reservoir, where the water lay disturbingly still. The surface caught the light just enough to give it the illusion of vitality, but it remained unervingly opaque, as if concealing secrets it refused to share. The memory of that terrified man's words played in my mind on loop. They wouldn't let me go. "Let's begin here," Elliot said, snapping me out of my thoughts. He knelt by the water's edge and began unpacking his satchel with precise, practiced movements. I watched as he produced a small vial and crouched low to collect a sample of the water. His hands moved steadily, undisturbed by the eerie ambience. "I don't understand how you can touch that stuff so casually," I muttered, crossing my arms in an effort to stave off the chill that had little to do with the weather. Elliot smirked faintly as he capped the vial. "It's water, Miguel. At least until evidence proves otherwise. It's cursed water, and you know it." I shot back, though my tone lacked conviction. I wasn't about to let my superstitions get the better of me. At least not outwardly. Elliot's smirk lingered briefly, but it was gone by the time he stood and slipped the vial into his bag. "Cursed or not, it needs to be examined." As he spoke, a faint movement caught my attention near the tree-line to our right. I turned instinctively, but whatever it was, if it was anything at all, disappeared before I could properly identify it. A trick of the light, perhaps, or my overactive imagination. I decided not to mention it. "What's your plan?" I asked instead, forcing my gaze back to him. "We follow the evidence," Elliot replied simply, his hands now busy examining one of the carved fragments we'd recovered from the drowned man. "Starting with these." The symbols etched into the stone were as perplexing as they were haunting. Despite poring over them for hours the previous night, I had yet to identify their precise origin. They bore a resemblance to Aztec motifs but deviated just enough to challenge any definitive classification. "I've seen similar designs before," I said, stepping closer to peer at the fragment. "But they're usually associated with rituals, offerings to appease gods or spirits. The patterns suggest water deities, but the craftsmanship—" I trailed off, shaking my head. "It's strange, almost like someone was imitating an older style but didn't quite understand it." Elliot nodded, his expression inscrutable as he traced the carvings with his finger. Could the miners have tried to replicate the design after finding the original artifacts? "It's possible," I admitted, "but if they didn't know what they were doing, they could have made mistakes, altered the meaning of the symbols. Rituals are precise for a reason. A single error can turn an offering into an insult." "That would explain the anger," Elliot murmured, almost to himself. His gaze shifted back to the water, his brows knitting together in thought. The sound of crunching leaves interrupted our conversation, and I turned to see a figure approaching, a wiry old man with a face that looked like it had weathered 100 storms. His clothes were practical and worn, his boots coated in dried mud. He carried a fishing rod slung over one shoulder, though it didn't appear he'd caught anything. "You the folks poking around about the drownings?" he called out, his voice rough but not unfriendly. Elliot straightened and inclined his head. "We are. I'm Elliot Brooks, and this is Miguel Vasquez." The man stopped a few paces away and regarded us with keen, assessing eyes. "Name's Orville Grant. Lived around these parts my whole life. Seen plenty of strange things, but nothing like this." "What have you seen, Mr. Grant?" I asked, stepping closer. Orville scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well, for one, that water ain't right. Never has been, not since they built that dam. Folks used to say the town down there was cursed, even before it got flooded. Something about what the miners dug up. Things they shouldn't be. Elliot's interest visibly sharpened. What kind of things? Relics, I think, Orville said, lowering his voice as though the reservoir might overhear. They say the miners found statues and carvings, stuff older than anything they'd ever seen. But instead of leaving it be, they brought it up, figured it might be worth something. Next thing you know, folks start disappearing. And when the dam came in, well, he gestured vaguely at the water. That put an end to the whole town. They disappeared before the dam? I asked, frowning. Some did, Orville confirmed. And the ones who didn't, well, let's just say not all of them made it out when the flood came. A heavy silence settled over us. Orville looked out at the reservoir with something akin to reverence, though it was laced with unease. I don't know what you're hoping to find, he said, but whatever's down there, it don't want to be disturbed. Elliot thanked him politely, though his mind was clearly elsewhere. As Orville wandered off, presumably to resume his fishing, I turned to Elliot. What do you make of that? I asked. He's not lying, Elliot said, his tone matter of fact. And his story lines up with what we've already uncovered. I nodded, though unease continued to gnaw at me. The idea of something ancient and angry lurking beneath the water was becoming harder to dismiss. And if Orville was right, we might be in far deeper than we realized. Elliot, as always, seemed undeterred. We need to access the dam records, he said. If the mining company documented anything about those relics, it might still be on file. And if it's not? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Elliot's faint smirk returned. Then we dig deeper. As we packed up and made our way back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that the reservoir was watching us. Its still surface betrayed nothing, but I felt its weight pressing against my mind, as though daring us to continue. The rational part of me dismissed it as paranoia, but the part that believed in curses, the part that had seen too much to entirely dismiss the supernatural, knew better. The rusted gates of the dam's maintenance yard groaned as they swung open, the sound reverberating against the thick pines surrounding us. The faint scent of damp earth and rotting leaves hung heavily in the air, mingling with the metallic tang emanating from the ancient machinery that loomed ahead. The morning had given way to a dim, overcast afternoon, and I couldn't help but feel that the sky reflected the ominous weight pressing down on this investigation. Elliot strode ahead, his footsteps purposeful but cautious on the gravel path. His sharp gaze swept over the yard with the precision of a predator, dissecting every shadow, every out-of-place object. The satchel on his shoulder hung slightly lower today, weighed down not just by his tools but by the mounting sense of unease that clung to us both. "Let's not waste time," he muttered, his voice low yet firm. "The dam records should be in the operations shed," assuming the company was halfway competent with their documentation. "Big assumption," I quipped, though my attempt at levity felt hollow in the heavy air. The operations shed stood at the far end of the yard, its peeling paint and cracked windows betraying years of neglect. We approached cautiously, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. It wasn't until we reached the door that I noticed the faint markings etched into the wooden frame, symbols almost identical to those on the carved stone fragments. "Elliot," I said, my voice tight as I gestured toward the markings. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he examined the symbols. Without a word, he reached into his satchel and pulled out his notebook, flipping to a page where he had carefully sketched the fragments we'd found earlier. He held the page up beside the door frame, comparing the designs. "They're the same," he murmured, his tone laced with both intrigue and unease. Someone marked this intentionally. Do you think the miners did this? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Elliot's brow furrowed slightly, a faint crease forming between his eyes. If they did, it wasn't to protect anyone. This feels like a warning or a boundary. He reached for the doorknob, but I grabbed his wrist before he could turn it. Wait, if these symbols are as old and significant as we think, shouldn't we proceed with caution? Elliot gave me a faint smirk, the kind that said he appreciated my concern but intended to press forward regardless. Caution is my middle name, he said dryly, and with that, he twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The interior of the shed was musty and dim, the air thick with the scent of mildew and aged paper. Shelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of dusty binders and faded maps. A single bare bulb dangled from the ceiling, flickering weakly as Elliot reached up to switch it on. Let's start with anything from the late 20s or early 30s, he said, his tone all business as he began scanning the labels on the binders. That's when the town was flooded, and the dam was completed. I nodded, moving to the opposite side of the room and pulling a particularly worn binder from the shelf. The brittle pages crackled as I flipped through them, my eyes scanning for anything that might hint at the relics or the miners' discoveries. Most of the entries were mundane, supply orders, maintenance logs, and payroll records, but one page caught my attention. Elliot, look at this, I said, holding up the binder. He crossed the room in a few long strides, his eyes immediately honing in on the page I indicated. It was a brief but unsettling note, written in a hurried scrawl. Item 124, recovered from Site B, requires immediate containment. Proceed with caution. No further excavation until authorized by Mr. R. Wilkes. Item 124? I said, frowning. What do you think they're referring to? Elliot's lips pressed into a thin line as he read the note again. If I had to guess, one of the relics. Site B was likely one of the deeper tunnels in the mine, where they must have uncovered something they didn't understand. And instead of leaving it alone, they brought it back here. I muttered, shaking my head. Greed trumps common sense every time. Elliot's gaze flicked up to meet mine, his expression grave. It's worse than that. They didn't just ignore the danger, they documented it and kept going anyway. This wasn't ignorance. It was deliberate. The weight of his words settled heavily between us, the implications sinking in. Whoever Mr. R. Wilkes was, he had made a conscious decision to prioritize profit over safety, or perhaps even over the lives of the miners themselves. Before I could respond, a sudden noise from outside sent a chill down my spine, a faint but distinct rustling, followed by what sounded like low, muffled voices. You hear that? I whispered, my hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight clipped to my belt. Elliot nodded, his hand already on the handle of his satchel, ready to retrieve whatever tool or weapon he deemed necessary. He moved toward the door with the silent precision of a predator, his footsteps barely making a sound on the shed's wooden floorboards. I followed closely, my pulse quickening as the sounds grew louder. The voices were unintelligible but carried an unmistakable tone of distress or urgency. As we stepped outside, the flickering light from the shed cast long, eerie shadows across the yard. The rustling came from the treeline, where dense undergrowth obscured our view of whatever or whoever was making the noise. Elliot motioned for me to stay back as he moved closer, his steps careful but determined. Hello? He called out, his voice firm and steady. The rustling stopped abruptly, the silence that followed almost deafening in its intensity. My grip on the flashlight tightened as I scanned the surrounding area, my eyes straining to pierce the growing darkness. And then, without warning, the reservoir erupted. A surge of water rose from its surface, towering like a wave before crashing back down with a deafening roar. The ground beneath our feet trembled, and I stumbled backward, barely managing to catch myself. Elliot remained upright, his gaze locked on the reservoir as though trying to decipher its violent outburst. But it wasn't just the water. Figures emerged from the waves, their forms shimmering and translucent, yet unmistakably human. Their faces were gaunt and skeletal, their hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They moved with a fluid, almost ethereal grace, their mouths opening and closing as though speaking words we couldn't hear. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as I stared at the apparitions. They were miners. There was no mistaking their tattered work clothes and rusted helmets. But they weren't alive. Not anymore. Elliot's voice broke through my stupor. "Miguel, stay behind me." I nodded mutely, unable to tear my gaze away from the ghostly figures. They hovered just above the water's surface, their movements synchronized as though guided by a single malevolent will. One of them raised a skeletal hand, pointing directly at us. The gesture was both accusatory and commanding, as though blaming us for their plight while daring us to act. Elliot stepped forward, his posture unwavering despite the obvious danger. "We're here to help," he said, his voice steady but louder than before. "If you want justice, we need to understand what happened." The figures didn't respond, but the air around us grew colder, and the water's surface began to churn violently once more. It was clear they weren't interested in talking. "Elliot," I hissed, my voice trembling, "we need to get out of here." He didn't move, his sharp eyes locked on the apparitions as though trying to decipher their intentions. "Not yet," he murmured almost to himself. "They're protecting something. What could they possibly?" Before I could finish, the ground beneath us shifted, and a deep, guttural noise rose from the reservoir, a sound that didn't belong in any natural world. The ghostly figures began to sink back into the water, their glowing eyes the last to disappear beneath the surface. Elliot turned to me, his expression grim. "We're running out of time." And for the first time since this investigation began, I didn't doubt him. The reservoir was like a glass eye staring back at us, unblinking and omnipotent. I could feel its presence even as the early morning fog clung to the land, wrapping the shoreline in an oppressive shroud. The air felt heavy, charged with static, as though the world itself was holding its breath. If Elliot was unnerved, he gave no sign. He stood at the water's edge, his trench coat fluttering lightly in the cold breeze, a silent sentinel facing the unknowable. "It's decided then," Elliot said at last, his voice carrying the calm finality of a man accustomed to peril. "We go down." I didn't bother arguing. At this point, I knew better. When Elliot set his mind to something, there was no dissuading him. But that didn't stop the knot of dread from tightening in my chest. "You've arranged everything with the diver?" I asked, attempting to keep my tone neutral despite the obvious apprehension swirling within me. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the misty expanse of water before us. "Yes, he'll meet us at the old dock in half an hour." I glanced back toward the pine forest behind us, half expecting the ghostly miners to emerge from the shadows. "And you think this is the only way? Actually diving into the reservoir?" Elliot turned to face me, his expression inscrutable but his eyes sharp. "The answers we need are beneath the surface, Miguel. If there's anything left of the town or the artifacts, it'll be down there." I couldn't fault his logic, but that didn't make the prospect any easier to stomach. The image of the spectral miners from the other night lingered in my mind, their hollow eyes burning with unrelenting rage. Whatever or whoever was down there didn't want to be disturbed. The arrival of the diver interrupted my spiraling thoughts. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a demeanor that suggested he had seen his fair share of danger. His wetsuit gleamed black in the pale light, and he carried his gear with practiced ease. "You must be Mr. Brooks," the man said, extending a hand to Elliot. "I'm Harry. You hired the best, so let's get this show on the road." Elliot shook his hand firmly, wasting no time with pleasantries. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. This isn't a typical dive, so I appreciate your willingness." Harry chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "I've done salvage work in plenty of places people shouldn't be poking around. I'm not easily spooked." I raised an eyebrow at that but said nothing. His confidence seemed genuine, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he didn't fully understand what he was walking into. Elliot briefed Harry on the situation with his characteristic efficiency, omitting the more supernatural elements but emphasizing the need for caution. By the time he finished, the diver seemed adequately serious, though still unfazed. We helped Harry load his gear onto a small rowboat moored at the dock. The boat itself was old, its paint chipped and weathered by years of exposure to the elements, but it seemed seaworthy enough. Elliot and I climbed aboard, and Harry took the oars, propelling us smoothly across the still waters of the reservoir. The silence was deafening. Even the birds had fallen quiet, as if the entire world had decided to withdraw from whatever madness we were about to encounter. The only sound was the gentle creak of the oars and the occasional drip of water falling back into the reservoir. Harry broke the silence first. "So what exactly are we looking for down there? Wreckage? Treasure? Artifacts?" Elliot replied simply, his gaze fixed on the water as though searching for the answers buried within. "Anything that might explain the incidents around the reservoir." Harry snorted softly. "Artifacts, huh? People dive for all sorts of things: gold, shipwrecks, history. But I've never heard of artifacts being worth this much trouble." "They're not ordinary artifacts," I said before I could stop myself. Both Harry and Elliot turned to look at me, and I immediately regretted speaking. "I mean, they're historically significant, possibly tied to the miners' last days before the town was flooded." Harry seemed satisfied with that explanation, but Elliot's gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before returning to the water. We reached the center of the reservoir, where the water was deepest. Harry prepared his gear with practiced efficiency, strapping on his oxygen tank and testing his regulator. I couldn't help but feel a pang of anxiety as he donned his mask and positioned himself at the edge of the boat. "Anything else I need to know before I go under?" Harry asked, his voice slightly muffled by the mask. "Stay alert," Elliot said simply, "and trust your instincts." Harry nodded, giving us a thumbs up before slipping gracefully into the water. The surface rippled briefly before settling back into its eerie stillness, leaving only a faint trail of bubbles to mark his descent. We waited in silence, the tension between us palpable. Elliot kept his eyes on the water, his expression unreadable. I tried to do the same, but my mind raced with thoughts of what Harry might encounter down there. The ghostly miners, the cursed relics, the buried town. It all seemed too much for one man to face alone. Minutes passed like hours. The faint trail of bubbles grew fainter still, until they disappeared entirely. My grip on the edge of the boat tightened, the wood digging into my palms. Should he be down there this long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm but tinged with unease. He knows what he's doing. We have to trust him. As if on cue, the water erupted beside the boat, and Harry broke the surface, gasping for air. He clung to the side of the boat, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. "Get me out!" he shouted, his voice trembling. "Get me out of here now." Elliot and I scrambled to pull him aboard, his sodden weight nearly tipping the boat. Once he was safely inside, he ripped off his mask and sucked in deep, ragged breaths. His hands shook as he clutched at the sides of the boat, his knuckles white. "What happened?" Elliot demanded, his voice sharp but steady. Harry shook his head, his breath still coming in gasps. "You didn't tell me about them." "About who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The miners," Harry choked out. "They're down there. Dozens of them. Their faces. Oh God, their faces." He trailed off, his eyes glazing over as though reliving whatever horror he had seen. I reached out to steady him, my own heart pounding in my chest. "Did you see the artifacts?" Elliot pressed, his tone unyielding. Harry shook his head violently. "I didn't get close enough. The moment I saw them, I knew I had to get out. They were just watching me, waiting." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I exchanged a grim look with Elliot. Whatever secrets lay beneath the reservoir, they weren't meant to be disturbed. The journey back to shore was somber, the silence broken only by Harry's labored breaths and the soft creak of the oars. By the time we reached the dock, the diver had recovered enough to speak again, though his voice was hoarse and trembling. "Don't go back," he said, his eyes darting between us. "Whatever you're looking for down there, it's not worth it." Elliot thanked him curtly before helping him unload his gear. I lingered by the water's edge, my gaze fixed on the reservoir that seemed to mock us with its placid surface. The shadows of the miners' faces danced in my mind, their hollow eyes a silent reminder of the depths we had yet to uncover. Elliot joined me after a moment, his expression as inscrutable as ever. "We're getting closer," he said softly. "To what?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking back toward the car, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the ever-present weight of the reservoir's watchful gaze. The wind howled through the trees as we made our way to the modest cabin we'd rented in town to serve as our base of operations. The night was unusually cold, and the sound of pine needles rasping against one another created a discordant symphony that seemed designed to unnerve. I didn't think it was my imagination that everything, from the shadows cast by the moonlight to the faint, almost imperceptible hum in the air, felt alive with malevolence, and every ounce of it seemed directed at us. Elliot walked ahead of me, his deliberate silence louder than any words he could have spoken. His trench coat billowed faintly in the wind, and his hat was pulled low over his brow, leaving his expression hidden. I couldn't decide if I was grateful for his stoic demeanor or annoyed by how calm he seemed when my nerves were fraying with every step we took. By the time we reached the cabin, the sense of foreboding had only deepened. Elliot unlocked the door, and I stepped inside quickly, eager to escape the night's oppressive grip. The interior was sparse but functional. A small kitchenette, a worn wooden table, 2 chairs, and a pair of narrow twin beds pushed against opposite walls. I dropped my satchel on the table and shrugged off my jacket, but the unease clung to me like a second skin. Elliot followed me in, closing the door behind him with a decisive click. He set his satchel down next to mine, then walked over to the small wood-burning stove in the corner. Without a word, he began arranging the kindling and striking a match. Within moments, the flames flickered to life, casting a warm, wavering glow that did little to dispel the tension in the room. "We need to talk about what happened out there," I said, breaking the silence. My voice sounded too loud, even to me. Elliot didn't look up from the stove. "We will," he said simply. The deliberate calmness of his tone only fueled my frustration. "Elliot, that man saw them, the miners. He wasn't hallucinating, and he wasn't exaggerating. They're real. They're down there, and they're angry." "I know," he said, finally straightening and turning to face me. His eyes were as sharp as ever, but there was something else in them now, a flicker of unease that he was clearly trying to hide. "That's why we need to be careful. Fear clouds judgment, and right now we can't afford mistakes." I wanted to argue, to demand that he admit how dangerous this had become, but I knew he was right. If we let our fear take control, we'd be no better off than the diver who had nearly lost his life. Still, the thought of returning to that reservoir, or worse, confronting whatever force resided there, made my stomach churn. "What's the next step, then?" I asked, folding my arms across my chest in a feeble attempt to steady myself. Elliot reached into his satchel and pulled out one of the carved stone fragments we'd recovered earlier. He placed it on the table between us, his expression turning contemplative. "These symbols," he began, tapping the fragment lightly with his index finger, "are the key. They're not just decorative, they're instructional, ritualistic." "I already told you that," I said, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "They're tied to water deities, but the execution is off. It's like whoever carved them was trying to recreate something older but got it wrong." "Exactly," Elliot said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he leaned closer to the fragment. "The question is, what did they get wrong? And why did it provoke such a violent response?" I stared at the fragment, the intricate patterns blurring slightly as my mind raced to piece together the puzzle. "It could be the placement," I said slowly. "Rituals like this are incredibly precise. Even a small deviation in the arrangement of symbols could change the meaning entirely." "Or the intent," Elliot added. "If the miners were focused on profit rather than reverence, they may have inadvertently turned a ritual of offering into one of desecration." The thought sent a chill down my spine. The idea that human greed could twist something sacred into something malevolent wasn't new, but it never failed to unsettle me. "We need to find the rest of the artifacts," Elliot said after a moment of silence. "If we can reconstruct the original design and interpret its purpose, we might be able to undo the damage." "And if we can't?" I asked, my voice quieter now. Elliot's gaze met mine, steady and unyielding. "Then we'll find another way." His confidence was reassuring, but I couldn't shake the nagging doubt that we were in over our heads. The reservoir, the miners, the artifacts, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle that didn't want to be solved. And yet I knew we couldn't turn back now. Not when the consequences of failure were so dire. As if sensing my thoughts, Elliot reached into his satchel again and pulled out a folded map. He spread it out on the table, revealing a detailed layout of the reservoir and the surrounding area. Several points were marked with small, precise XS, each accompanied by handwritten notes in Elliot's neat script. These are the areas where the miners were most active before the town was flooded, he explained, tracing a line with his finger. If the remaining artifacts are still intact, they'll be in one of these locations. And how exactly do we plan on retrieving them? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Elliot's faint smirk returned. The same way we found the first one. Careful observation, meticulous research, and a bit of luck. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. You make it sound so simple. It never is, he admitted, his tone surprisingly light. But that's what makes it worthwhile. For a moment, the tension lifted, and I found myself smiling despite the gravity of the situation. Elliot had a way of grounding me, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. It was one of the reasons I stuck by him, no matter how dangerous or bizarre our cases became. The moment passed quickly, though, as the reality of our task loomed large once more. I studied the map, committing the marked locations to memory, then turned my attention back to the fragment on the table. If we're going to do this, I said, my voice firm now, we need more than just luck. We need to understand what we're dealing with. Elliot nodded, his expression turning serious once more. Agreed. And that starts with you decoding the symbols. I hesitated, my gaze dropping to the fragment again. The patterns were intricate, almost hypnotic, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me as much as I was studying them. I'll do my best, I said at last, though I wasn't entirely sure my best would be enough. Elliot's faint smirk returned, this time tinged with genuine warmth. I wouldn't expect anything less. The fire crackled softly in the stove, casting flickering shadows across the room as I settled into my task. Elliot returned to his own work, his focus as unwavering as ever. The night stretched on, filled with the quiet rustle of paper and the occasional scrape of pen against notebook. And though the oppressive weight of the reservoir still lingered in the back of my mind, I found a strange sense of comfort in the rhythm of our efforts. For better or worse, we were in this together. And whatever lay ahead, I knew we'd face it side by side. The next morning came reluctantly, the sun rising behind a thick veil of clouds that drained the landscape of color. The cabin's small window framed a view of the reservoir in the distance, its surface gleaming faintly with that same eerie stillness I had come to dread. It felt as if the world had conspired to hold its breath, waiting for us to act. Elliot was already up by the time I dragged myself out of bed, his meticulous handwriting scrawled across the notepad on the table. His coat hung neatly on the back of his chair, and he was leaning over the map we had studied the night before, tracing lines and marking locations with renewed intensity. "Coffee's on," he said without looking up, his pen pausing briefly to add a note in the margin. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and shuffled over to the kitchen nook, pouring a cup of coffee that was more bitter than I would have liked. "Did you sleep at all?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Elliot shook his head, finally straightening and turning to face me. "There's too much to sort through," he said, his voice low but steady. "The pieces are all there. We just need to fit them together." I took a sip of the coffee, wincing slightly at its sharpness. "And have you figured out what those pieces add up to?" Elliot's gaze flicked back to the map, his expression momentarily distant. "We're close," he said finally. "Closer than we've ever been. But there's still one thing we need to confirm." I frowned, setting my mug down on the counter. "And what's that?" He looked at me then, his eyes sharp but shadowed with fatigue. "We need to see the dam." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I felt my chest tighten, the knot of dread that had taken root there over the past few days pulling taut. You think the artifacts are connected to the dam? It's not just the artifacts, Elliot said, his tone edged with certainty. It's the dam itself. It's the linchpin in all of this, an artificial barrier that disrupted something ancient, something that was never meant to be disturbed. I opened my mouth to argue, to point out the dangers of such a direct approach, but the look in Elliot's eyes stopped me. He wasn't guessing, I realized. He knew. When do we leave? I asked instead, my voice quieter now. Elliot's faint smirk returned, though it was tinged with weariness. As soon as you're ready. The drive to the dam was uneventful, the narrow mountain roads winding through dense pine forests that seemed to close in around us with every mile. The closer we got, the more oppressive the air became, as if the dam itself radiated a kind of invisible pressure that weighed heavily on the surrounding landscape. When we finally arrived, the dam loomed before us like a monolithic sentinel, its concrete walls stretching impossibly high above the reservoir. The sound of rushing water echoed faintly in the distance, a constant reminder of the immense force contained within. Elliot parked the car near the maintenance entrance, his movements precise and deliberate. He stepped out and retrieved his satchel from the back seat, slinging it over his shoulder with the practiced ease of a man who had done this 100 times before. I followed suit, my own satchel feeling heavier than usual despite its relatively light contents. The maintenance entrance was marked by a rusted steel door, its surface pitted and corroded by years of exposure to the elements. Elliot produced a set of lockpicks from his pocket and went to work, his fingers moving with the kind of steady precision that only came with experience. The lock clicked open after a few moments, and Elliot pushed the door open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into the bowels of the dam. The air inside was damp and stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic that I couldn't quite place. "We need to find the control room," Elliot said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "That's where the schematics and operational records will be." I nodded, my grip tightening on the flashlight in my hand. The beam of light cut through the darkness ahead, revealing walls lined with pipes and cables that seemed to stretch on forever. As we descended, the sound of rushing water grew louder, a deep, rhythmic thrum that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the dam. It was an unsettling reminder of the immense power contained within and the potential for devastation if that power were ever unleashed. The control room was located near the center of the dam, its reinforced door marked with a faded sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." Elliot pushed the door open, and we stepped inside, the stale air giving way to a faint hum of electricity. The room was filled with rows of control panels, their dials and switches now coated with a thin layer of dust. A large window overlooked the reservoir on one side, while the other walls were lined with filing cabinets and shelves stacked with binders and manuals. Elliot moved to the cabinets first, his fingers rifling through the folders with practiced efficiency. I joined him, scanning the labels for anything that might hint at the dam's construction or the events leading up to the town's flooding. It wasn't long before we found what we were looking for, a folder marked Construction Incidents. Elliot pulled it out and laid it on the nearest table, his eyes scanning the pages with a mixture of focus and urgency. The documents detailed several accidents and delays during the dam's construction, but one entry stood out, a cryptic note about unusual materials recovered during excavation, accompanied by a warning to proceed with caution. "They knew," Elliot muttered, his voice laced with quiet anger. "They knew they were disrupting something, and they went ahead anyway. I felt a surge of frustration and unease. But why? Why risk so much for a project like this? Money, power, ego, Elliot said, his tone flat. It doesn't matter. What matters is what we do now. He turned to me, his expression resolute. We need to locate the primary intake valve. If the artifacts are influencing the dam, that's where we'll find the strongest connection. I hesitated, my mind racing with the implications of his words. And if we find something there, what then? Elliot's gaze was unwavering. Then we deal with it, whatever it takes. The intake valve chamber was deep within the dam, accessible only through a series of narrow tunnels that seemed to twist and turn endlessly. The air grew colder the further we went, and the sound of rushing water became almost deafening. When we finally reached the chamber, I was struck by the sheer scale of it. The walls were lined with massive steel pipes, their surfaces glistening with condensation. A faint, otherworldly hum filled the air, sending a shiver down my spine. Elliot moved to the center of the chamber, his flashlight beam revealing a series of strange markings etched into the concrete floor. They were similar to the symbols on the stone fragments, intricate and precise but subtly wrong. "This is it," he said, kneeling to examine the markings more closely. "This is where it all converges." As I stepped closer, I felt an almost physical pull toward the symbols, as if they were drawing me in. The air seemed to vibrate with energy, and for a moment, I could swear I heard faint whispers, angry, accusatory, and filled with sorrow. Elliot's voice cut through the haze. "Miguel, stay focused. We need to document this." I nodded, pulling out my notebook and pen with trembling hands. As I began to sketch the symbols, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not just by the reservoir, but by something far older and far more dangerous. Something that was waiting. The symbols on the chamber floor seemed to shift under the flickering light of our flashlights. I wasn't sure if it was some trick of the shadows or if the markings were alive, writhing in silent defiance of our intrusion. My hand tightened around my notebook as I sketched the patterns as accurately as I could, but every stroke of the pen felt inadequate, as though the symbols defied being captured on paper. Elliot crouched near one of the etched lines, his gloved fingers brushing against the damp concrete. "Do you feel that?" he murmured, his voice low, as though afraid to speak too loudly. I paused my sketching and focused on the air around us. It was faint but undeniable, a low hum that seemed to resonate within my chest, as though the very walls of the dam were vibrating. "It's like pressure," I said, struggling to find the right words. "Like something's building." Elliot nodded, his sharp gaze fixed on the markings. "It's energy," he said. "Raw, unfiltered energy. Whatever this ritual was meant to do, it was never completed, but the potential remains." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling heavily in my chest. The idea that the dam was sitting atop a reservoir of not just water but of unspent power, ancient and volatile, was almost too much to comprehend. But I didn't doubt Elliot's assessment. He had an uncanny ability to perceive things I could only guess at. As I returned to my sketches, a sudden chill swept through the chamber, prickling the hairs on the back of my neck. The hum grew louder, a low and mournful sound that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the reservoir. I glanced at Elliot, who had risen to his feet, his hand resting on the edge of his satchel. "They know we're here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't need to ask who they were. The ghostly miners, the ones who had haunted Harry and now seemed to haunt us in turn. They were watching, waiting. My heartbeat quickened as the temperature in the room continued to drop, our breath visible now in the frigid air. "We can't leave without answers," Elliot said, his tone resolute. He stepped carefully around the symbols, his movements deliberate as he approached the far side of the chamber. There, embedded in the wall, was a rusted steel panel that appeared to have been undisturbed for decades. "What is that?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly as I followed him. "The intake control," Elliot replied. "This valve regulates the flow of water into the dam's turbines. If the artifacts were placed here intentionally, this would be the logical point of convergence." I hesitated, my mind racing with questions. "And if we open it?" Elliot's jaw tightened, the only visible sign of his own uncertainty. "Then we find out what's been hidden." Before I could argue, he reached into his satchel and retrieved a wrench. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the chamber as he worked to loosen the bolts on the panel. I hovered nearby, torn between my fear of what might happen and my inability to leave him to face it alone. With one final twist, the panel came free, revealing a dark recess beyond. A faint, unnatural glow emanated from within, casting eerie shadows across Elliot's face. He reached inside carefully, his gloved hand brushing against something solid. When he withdrew his hand, he held a small, intricately carved artifact, another piece of the puzzle. The carvings matched the symbols on the floor, their patterns etched with an otherworldly precision that seemed to defy human craftsmanship. "This is it," Elliot said, his voice laced with both awe and apprehension. "This is the source." The artifact pulsed faintly in his hand, the glow intensifying for a moment before fading again. I felt the hum grow stronger, reverberating through the floor and into my very bones. "We need to get out of here," I said, unable to hide the urgency in my voice. "This place, it's unstable." Elliot nodded, carefully wrapping the artifact in a cloth before placing it in his satchel. "You're right," he said, "but we're not done yet. We need to return this to its rightful place." "Rightful place," I echoed, my mind struggling to keep up. "You mean the reservoir?" Elliot's gaze met mine, his eyes sharp and unwavering. "Not the reservoir," he said. "The town beneath it." The journey back to the surface was a blur, the oppressive weight of the dam pressing down on us with every step. By the time we emerged into the open air, the sky had darkened, the clouds thick and heavy with the promise of rain. The reservoir stretched out before us, its surface rippling faintly in the rising wind. "We can't do this alone," I said as we climbed into the car. My hands trembled as I gripped the edges of my seat. "If we're going back to the town, if we're diving into those waters, we'll need help." Elliot glanced at me, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he said, starting the engine. "But whoever we bring into this will need to understand the risks." I nodded, my throat dry. The image of Harry's pale, terrified face flashed through my mind, a stark reminder of what we were up against. And yet, as the car sped down the winding mountain roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. The reservoir loomed in the distance, its dark waters holding secrets that were about to be unearthed, whether we were ready or not. The boat rocked gently as it drifted toward the center of the reservoir. The oars creaked rhythmically as Elliot rowed, his movements as precise as ever, though his silence weighed heavily in the frigid air. Dawn had yet to break, and the world around us remained cloaked in a veil of darkness. The only light came from the lantern secured to the bow, its dim glow casting flickering shadows across the water. I sat across from Elliot, clutching the satchel that contained the artifact we had retrieved from the dam. It felt heavier than it should have, as though the object carried the weight of the miner's sorrow and rage. My fingers brushed the edges of the fabric, and for a moment, I thought I felt it pulse faintly, like a heartbeat. I pulled my hand away, my chest tight with unease. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, breaking the oppressive silence. My voice sounded strained, even to me. Elliot didn't look up, his focus fixed on the water ahead. "As sure as I can be," he said, his tone steady but low. "The town beneath the reservoir is the key. If we're going to end this, we need to return the artifact to its rightful place. And if the miners don't see it that way?" I countered, my grip tightening on the satchel. Elliot met my gaze then, his blue eyes sharp and unwavering. "Then we'll face them together." The resolve in his voice was reassuring, but it didn't dispel the knot of dread coiled in my stomach. The memory of the spectral miners still haunted me. Their hollow eyes, their accusing gestures, their unnatural silence. They weren't simply angry. They were vengeful, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap. The boat slowed as we neared the spot Elliot had marked on his map, the site where the old church had stood before the town was swallowed by water. He shipped the oars and secured them, then reached into his own satchel to retrieve the diving gear we had brought with us. I swallowed hard, watching as he unrolled the lines and prepared the harness. "You really think it's down there?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Elliot paused, his hands steady as he adjusted the straps. "Everything points to this location," he said. "The church was the heart of the town. If the miners left anything behind, anything connected to the artifact, it'll be there." I nodded, though my chest ached with apprehension. "And you're going down alone?" He straightened, his expression calm but firm. "I need you up here to monitor the lines and keep watch. If anything happens, I'll need you to pull me back." The weight of his words settled heavily between us. I wanted to protest, to insist on going down with him, but I knew he was right. Someone had to stay behind, and Elliot's experience with dives like this far surpassed mine. "Be careful," I said finally, my voice tight. He gave me a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Always." Elliot donned the gear with practiced efficiency, securing the harness and oxygen tank before lowering himself carefully into the water. The lantern's light reflected off the surface, creating rippling patterns that seemed to dance around him as he disappeared into the depths. I watched the line unspool, my hands gripping it tightly as I counted the seconds in my head. The silence that followed was unbearable. The water lapped softly against the boat, but beneath that gentle rhythm, I could feel the reservoir's tension, the heavy, oppressive presence that seemed to emanate from the depths. My eyes darted across the surface, searching for any sign of movement, any ripple that didn't belong. Minutes passed like hours. My hands grew clammy, the lines slick against my palms. I stared at the glowing depth gauge, willing it to remain steady, to show that Elliot was still descending safely. But the longer I waited, the more the dread inside me grew. And then the line jerked. It was faint at first, a subtle tug that could have been nothing more than a shift in the current. But it came again, stronger this time, followed by a vibration that traveled through the rope and into my hands. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the line tighter, straining to listen. A muffled sound reached my ears, faint and distorted, but unmistakable. It was Elliot's voice, coming through the crackling static of the dive radio. "Found it, but there's movement," Not alone. The signal cut out abruptly, replaced by a low, mournful wail that sent chills down my spine. My breath hitched, and I pulled at the line instinctively, desperate to bring Elliot back to the surface. But the line resisted, as though something on the other end was pulling against me. "Elliot!" I shouted, my voice trembling with panic. "Elliot, answer me!" The water erupted around the boat, and I fell backward, scrambling to keep my balance as the reservoir roared to life. Waves crashed against the sides of the boat, and I clung to the edge, my knuckles white. The lantern tipped over, its light flickering wildly before plunging into the water and disappearing. In the chaos, I saw them, the miners. Their spectral forms rose from the depths, their gaunt faces twisted in silent anguish. Their hollow eyes burned with an unnatural light, and their skeletal hands reached toward the boat, toward me. My chest tightened with fear, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Elliot!" I screamed, my voice barely audible over the roar of the water. The line jerked violently, and I nearly lost my grip. Gritting my teeth, I hauled with all my strength, dragging the rope inch by inch until finally, Elliot's head broke the surface. He was gasping for air, his mask askew, but he was alive. "Get us out of here!" he shouted, his voice hoarse but urgent. I pulled him aboard, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the harness. The miners closed in, their movements fluid and unnatural, their silent cries echoing in my mind. Elliot grabbed the oars, his strength undiminished despite his ordeal, and began rowing with a speed I didn't think possible. The boat surged forward, cutting through the chaotic waves as the miners reached for us, their translucent forms gliding across the water with an eerie grace. The hum in the air grew deafening, a chorus of sorrow and rage that seemed to pierce my very soul. But just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The water stilled, the miners vanished, and the hum faded into silence. The boat drifted, its momentum slowing as the lantern's glow returned faintly from below. I collapsed onto the bench, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. Elliot rested the oars, his hands gripping the wood tightly as he stared out at the reservoir. His expression was unreadable, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of what we had just faced pressing down on him. "We can't stop," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Not yet." I nodded, though every fiber of my being wanted to disagree. We had survived the encounter, but the miners' message was clear. They weren't done with us, and neither was the reservoir. The sun was barely a smudge of pale light on the horizon as we returned to the dock for what we both knew would be the final confrontation. The reservoir stretched out before us, vast and menacing, its surface eerily still. The artifact felt heavier than ever in my satchel, as if it carried with it the weight of every lost soul trapped beneath the water. Elliot stood beside me, his calm demeanor unshaken by the events of the previous night. But I could see it in his eyes, the quiet resolve of a man who understood the stakes. "This is it," he said, adjusting the strap of his satchel. "The artifact goes back to the heart of the town, and we make things right." "And if we don't?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot's gaze remained fixed on the water. "Then they won't stop. Not until they've taken everything." I swallowed hard, nodding as I hoisted my satchel onto my shoulder. The boat waited for us, its weathered frame creaking faintly in the morning breeze. Together, we climbed aboard, the weight of unspoken fears heavy between us. Elliot took the oars, his movements steady as the boat glided across the reservoir. The water was unervingly calm, its glassy surface reflecting the overcast sky above. I sat in the bow, my hands gripping the edges of the satchel as I watched the horizon. Every ripple, every shift in the water felt like a warning, a reminder that we were trespassing where we didn't belong. The journey to the center of the reservoir felt endless. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the oars and the occasional splash as they cut through the water. My mind raced with thoughts of what lay beneath us: the sunken town, the angry miners, the energy we had disturbed. For all our preparation, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were woefully unprepared for what was to come. "We're here," Elliot said at last, his voice low and steady. I looked up to see the spot he had marked on his map the night before, the center of the reservoir, where the steeple of the old church supposedly rested beneath the water. The thought of it sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to focus. This was the heart of the town, the place where the miners had lived, worked, and ultimately died. And it was where we would either succeed or fail. Elliot secured the oars and reached into his satchel, pulling out the artifact. It pulsed faintly in his hands, the carvings glowing with an otherworldly light. He set it carefully on the floor of the boat, then began unpacking the rest of our gear. "We'll need to dive again," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "The artifact has to be returned to the altar in the church." I nodded, my stomach churning with apprehension. "And you think that will be enough to stop all this?" "It's the only chance we have," Elliot said, his gaze meeting mine. "But I'll need your help this time." I hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. Diving into those waters, knowing what awaited us beneath, was almost too much to bear. But the look in Elliot's eyes, his unwavering determination, left me no room for doubt. "Okay," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Let's do this." The water was colder than I had imagined, the icy chill cutting through the layers of my wetsuit and seeping into my bones. Elliot and I descended slowly, the dim light from our waterproof flashlights barely penetrating the murky depths. The deeper we went, the more the world above seemed to fade away, replaced by an all-encompassing silence that felt almost suffocating. And then we saw it. The remains of the church emerged from the shadows, its steeple rising like a skeletal hand reaching for salvation. The structure was remarkably intact, its stone walls covered in a thin layer of algae and silt. The windows were shattered, the glass long gone, but the heavy wooden doors still stood, partially ajar. Elliot motioned for me to follow as he approached the doors, his movements deliberate and careful. The artifact pulsed faintly in his hand, its glow intensifying as we neared the entrance. My heart pounded in my chest as I swam behind him, my flashlight beam sweeping across the interior of the church. The space inside was vast and empty, the pews scattered haphazardly across the floor. At the far end of the nave, the altar stood, its surface carved with the same intricate symbols as the artifact. The air, if it could even be called that, felt thick with tension, as though the church itself was holding its breath. Elliot approached the altar, his movements steady despite the oppressive atmosphere. He placed the artifact carefully on the stone surface, aligning it with the carvings as though completing a puzzle. The glow intensified, the light spreading across the altar and into the surrounding walls. For a moment, nothing happened, and then the ground began to shake. The hum returned, louder than ever, a deep, mournful sound that reverberated through the church and into my very bones. The water around us churned violently, sending silt and debris swirling into the air. I clung to the nearest pew for support, my heart racing as the walls seemed to pulse with energy. The miners appeared. They rose from the shadows, their spectral forms gliding silently through the water. Their hollow eyes burned with an unrelenting light, their faces twisted in anguish. But this time there was something different about them. They didn't reach for us. They didn't move to attack. Instead, they hovered near the altar, their gazes fixed on the artifact. "It's working," Elliot said through the dive radio, his voice tight but hopeful. The light from the artifact grew brighter, enveloping the miners in its glow. Their forms began to change, their gaunt faces softening, their hollow eyes filling with something that resembled peace. One by one, they began to fade, their silhouettes dissolving into the light until only the artifact remained. The hum subsided, the water stilling as the energy dissipated. The church felt empty now, but in a way that was almost comforting. The oppressive weight that had hung over the reservoir seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of quiet reverence. Elliot turned to me, his expression one of quiet triumph. "It's done." I nodded, my chest tight with emotion. We had done it. We had brought peace to the miners, ended the curse, and restored balance to a place that had been shrouded in darkness for far too long. As we ascended back to the surface, the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting the reservoir in a warm, golden light. The water shimmered, no longer menacing, but beautiful in its stillness. And for the first time since we had arrived, I felt a sense of hope.